Thank you so much, dear Madam President Lali, members of the Oxford Union, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for this very warm welcome and for this very kind introduction. And thank you, Lali, for inviting me to give the chance and to be a part of this inaugural Women's Leadership Speaker Series that you have hosted here. It is a great honor and privilege to be standing in this hall one more time, where so many extraordinary and truly inspiring people have shared their stories, where they have talked about their experiences, the hardship they encountered in their life, the achievements and the hopes and dreams they wished to see come true. I would like to thank the Oxford Union Society, especially for hosting so many remarkable women speakers, such as Mother Teresa, former British Prime Minister Thatcher, former US Secretary Albright, former US House Speaker Pelosi, and so many others. I was thrilled to see that this evening another women's rights champion, Golden Globe winner, Glenn Close, is also scheduled to offer her remarks. And I am delighted also to see so many women today sitting among us. Today's discussion comes at the eve of the International Women's Day, and on my way coming here to UK, I naturally had to think about the sacrifice of the British women who stood up to their rights and paved the way for the next generation to live in a better and a more just world. I thought about Emmeline Pankhurst, Micheline Fawcett, and Emily Davis, the leading figures in the suffering movement in Britain. At the same time, I thought about British men such as Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, George Lansbury, and others who, throughout history, stood beside a woman, recognizing that a male-dominated world cannot guarantee peace, stability, and prosperity. That women and men should enjoy equal rights and equal opportunities. These women and men changed the entire course of history of nation. They paved the way for the commencement of the Representation of the People Act, which is the foundation of the modern democratic United Kingdom we see today. Therefore, I salute to them and all women and men who fought and continue to fight for gender equality across the globe. Kosovo, my country, recently celebrated its 10th anniversary of independence, and we look up to democracies like yours in our efforts to strengthen and improving our system. So my ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with you today to share my story and my experience as a woman leader, the first woman president of the Republic of Kosovo, a small, new country in southeastern part of Europe, the Western Balkans. When I took office back in 2011, Kosovo was facing turbulent times. The country was in a deep political, social, and economic deadlock. People were striving for change and were desperately in need for a leader who would unify the divided, include those left out, and reach out to those who were almost forgotten by the system. I felt it was my moral duty to meet these expectations and work towards improvement and prosperity for my country. It was an immense honor for me to represent my country and my people, and with a woman as the president for the first time in the history of the modern Balkans, and the youngest one in the age elected to this position in the world, Kosovo received a greater attention. While my appointment as a president was skeptically viewed by conservative power holders, it gave hope to the others inside Kosovo and abroad, who saw this as a chance for women to gain back the rightful place at the decision-making table. Serving in the country's highest office was an important step to changing perceptions in a traditional patriarchal society. I knew I have to prove skeptics wrong, and in the meantime, lift up marginalized and underrepresented citizens by giving them a voice and by fighting for their rights. The pressure on me was high, and so were the expectations. Throughout my entire career in the public service, I placed the well-being of my country and my people first, and that has been my guide. During my 5 term of tenure, I sought to strengthen the rule of law and adherence to the country's constitution, which guarantees the equal rights and liberties for all the citizens in Kosovo, regardless of their ethnic, political, or religious background. I encouraged modesty and stood by ordinary citizens to listen directly to their concerns. I dedicated my work to promoting peace, reconciliation, and dialogue at all levels of our society. By expanding the table and adding more chairs to include women, marginalized groups, minorities, and other groups that traditionally have been absent to our conversations and to the decision-making. I devoted much of my time visiting our citizens in the heart of the country, especially in the rural areas, which often tends to be removed from the policy-making centers, and yet they are at the front line of our decisions. It worried me to see young people wandering aimlessly around with no job and no opportunities for further education. I was concerned when I witnessed hundreds of the young women and men leaving the country in their quest for a better life abroad. And it broke my heart to see women widows struggling to provide their families on their own after their husbands were killed during the war. But out of this despair and tragedy, these women managed to find their strength and were now a living example of hope in the face of adversity. As they worked hard to rebuild their lives, to ensure a safer, a better future for their children and for themselves. In fact, the women of my country, Kosovo, have always been courageous and at the forefront of decisive moments in our history, playing a crucial role in the state-building processes, both during the peaceful civil resistance, during our post-conflict recovery efforts, and the consolidation of our statehood. They are the concourse of our struggle for freedom and independence. During the time of the Serbian regime in Kosovo, which was marked by repression, isolation, and serious violation of the human rights, women were the one who stood up against this injustice. While thousands of Albanian men were beaten up, tortured, and imprisoned, women organized among themselves and took it to the streets to raise their voice against the inhumanities committed by this regime. Their vigorous determination for resistance continued also during the late 90s, when many Kosovo women did not hesitate to stand at the front line of the war. These who remained home zealously protected the soil of their families, the home of their sons and daughters, standing fearlessly ready to sacrifice their lives for the generations to come. Their steady determination, however, was faced with remorseless violence, crime, and destruction committed by the Serbian military. While men were tortured to death or killed in order to eliminate the traditional providers of the family, thousands of women were beaten up and raped as a way of dishonoring them in front of their families, neighbors, and the entire community. There were also men who were victims of the sexual violence during the war, but the majority of them were women. The systematic campaign of rape unleashed during Kosovo's war by the Serbian forces intended to undo the social fabric of our society, to leave us scared, scarred, ashamed, and deeply broken, to continue the war long after it has ended. Indeed, for the rape survivors of war, the war did not end, even though they boldly withstood the horrors of the war. When the conflict ended, they had no space to tell their stories. There was no effort to bring their perpetrators towards the justice. Their only support were women activists who had dedicated their lives to helping these survivors in dealing with the trauma they have experienced. And these activists were the pillars on which the survivors of the sexual violence leaned for over a decade. When the rest of the society was too preoccupied in rebuilding amid the heroic narratives of triumph and bravery that normally follow a liberation war, in the chaotic aftermath of the war and uncertainty over Kosovo's legal status and it became an independent state, most of them opted for a complete silence. Others, unable to deal with the pain, came forward to their family members only to be abandoned by them due to the stigma that rape carries in every society, mine included. Witnessing the discouraging environment that surrounded the war rape survivors, I decided to create a platform that would exclusively address this issue. After a thorough analysis of my legal and constitutional powers, I decided to act in order to bring to an end their suffering. Back in 2014, I established the National Council of the Survivors of Sexual Violence, which presented the first institutional response to publicly address the issue of the survivors of the sexual violence during the war in Kosovo. To fight the stigma still surrounding the survivors and to work tirelessly to treat them with the respect and dignity like we had done with all other categories of the war victims. Just several weeks after it was established, the Council managed to push forward the amendment of the existing legislation on the war victims and survivors, finally recognizing the status of the survivors of the sexual violence and granting them so much needed legal rights. But we had to move beyond existing laws and regulation in order to let the survivors of the sexual violence speak their piece of truth publicly. We had to tell to the world once and for all that of the horrendous crimes that were perpetrated towards 20,000 women and men of my country. As politics had failed these women and men for so many years, we had to find other modalities to facilitate public discussions in support of all of the survivors. As a part of these efforts, I decided to support an awareness-raising initiative by an artist, Alketa Jaffa America, and a producer, Ana Dilelio, with the aim to mobilize citizens of the different backgrounds in support of all of the survivors. Under the theme, Thinking of You, the idea was to create a giant art installation by collecting dresses and to hang them on the washing lines in the football pitch in the capital city of Kosovo. transforming this public space in a symbol of solidarity and collective empathy with the survivors of the sexual violence. In this endeavor, the artist, my staff, and I were joined by many supporters from the civil society, government, and the media, traveling across the country to collect dresses who very often contained personal stories attached to them. For some, it was a dress they have worn when they signed the Declaration of the Independence of Kosovo. For others, it was an engagement dress worn by survivors whose dreams of marriage and normal life were cut in half. The thousands of skirts and dresses that were collected and hung in Pristina's football pitch were a sight that could no longer be ignored. And talking about the survivors of the sexual violence was no longer a taboo topic for my society. The art installation significantly contributed to the process of collective healing and encouraged more victims to come forward with their stories. Many more women approached my office after this art installation. Even after my 5 years term as the president has ended, I continue to personally meet numerous of women who were raped during the wartime in my country. Just recently, less than a month after the verification process of the status of the survivors of sexual violence during the war in Kosovo was launched, I sat for several hours with the war rape survivors and listened to their concerns, their fears, and their uncertainties about their own future. The verification for which of all survivors of sexual violence during the war in Kosovo can apply will enable victims to receive a monthly compensation, obtained and easier access to the trauma treatment and the health services. We have made significant progress as a country to take an institutionalized approach to address the issue of the survivors of the sexual violence in public, to recognize their legal status as civilian victims of the war, and to pave the way for further reparations concerning rehabilitation and resocialization services. But we still have a long way to go to offer them the justice they deserve, because justice is the most fundamental demand of all the war rape survivors. For these survivors, peace is tightly linked with the perpetrators facing the justice. What they need is to put an end to this culture of impunity. And we shall leave no stone unturned until all the perpetrators are put behind the bars, and we shall leave no opportunity wasted to remind neighboring country of Serbia that it must deliver these criminals to the court. So, dear students and dear friends, regardless of the many achievements we have reached in promoting gender equality, we still live in a world where women are denied equal rights, where they are deprived of education, of their right to decide and control what happens with their bodies, where young girls are forced into marriage, where victims of the sexual harassment and even rape are denied the access to the justice. When I think about hundreds of the sex slaves of the ISIS, dozens of the young Indian women on a daily basis who became the target of the acid attacks just because they reject the marriage proposal, or the African young women who have been subjected to the horrors of the female genital mutilation, have the feeling that we are going backwards instead of moving forward. But then I look around And even in a small country like mine, Kosovo, I see incredible, powerful women who had the strength to look ahead in the worst days of their lives. I see women like Ferdonia Cherkesi, whose entire family, her husband, her 3 sons, daughters-in-law, and nephews and nieces, have been killed during the war, leaving her with nothing. Finding the strength in a hope that one day their bodies will return home so they can be given an honorable burial. I look at the women of Kruša Mlade, a little village in the western part of my country of Kosovo that is often called the village of the war widows. Upon the rubbles of destruction and immense human suffering, pain and trauma, the women of this village stood united, courageous and vigorously decided to build their own future by establishing Cooperativa Kruša, one of the most successful agricultural enterprises in the entire country of Kosovo today. Then I see so much potential when I look at the younger women, girls like Blerta Thaci, Dafina Luri, and Blerina Meta, the founders of Open Data Kosovo, an initiative that promotes the idea that governance data should be available free of charge and free of restrictions. Their efforts to promote transparency put these 3 young women from Kosovo on the Forbes magazine 30 under 30 listing in the field of the European law and policy. And I see a Kosovo British pop singers, Rita Ora and Dua Lipa, whose popularity across the globe has skyrocketed over the past years and who have truly lived up to their role as the honorary ambassadors of their own country of Kosovo, making us proud everywhere they are and they perform. And I see so many other young, bright and strong women who are contributing to change one step at a time. And I see the true agents of change that are already contributing to a better and more equal country they live, including mine. And I see a lot of hope in our young generations, be in my country or being elsewhere. I thank you very much.
So, your overnight transition from policewoman to the fourth president of Kosovo was said to have stunned the nation, and at the time raised questions about your eligibility as a woman without a political background. How did you deal with the critics?
Well, Lale, as I said in my very initial remarks today, in the time when I was elected, my country was in the deep political and economical and social crisis. Just 6 months before my elections as the president, the Constitutional Court of Kosovo has ruled down 2 previous presidents for the violation of the Constitution, which they have been obliged to resign. Country just came out of the new round of the parliamentary elections, which was followed by many of the criticism, including of the many negative reports by the International Observatory Mission. And that time, country was in the age of the major destruction in many of the regards. And that time, 3 main political parties in the country came up with the proposal to nominate a consensual candidate which would be put forward for the voting as the president or as the head of the state. So somehow my name has came up as the proposal, as a joint proposal by the three major political parties in the country that time, based into my background and the over 15 years of the service as the public servant, as the based into the integrity that I had presented for the years serving as the public servants. And none of the candidates that the parties had in the mix that time was able to generate the necessary votes required to be elected as the president. And that time I was put forward, and for the first time in the history of my country, president was elected in the first round of the elections with over 80% of the votes. So it took about 3 men to nominate a woman to come and fix the mess that they have created. So but I was not conscious about the difficulties and the obstacles that I will be facing the first day that I took over the office. I was very much conscious that I was not only being elected as the president of Kosovo, but I was very much conscious that I was the first woman to be ever elected in the history of my country, in the history of the entire region of the southeastern part of the Europe, or the Western Balkans, as we refer sometimes. And by age at that time, I was only 35 years of age. I was the youngest ever elected leader in the world. And for me, it was not only the responsibility and the constitutional and legal responsibilities in one side, but it was also about responsibilities and the legacy that I was about to leave behind for the other women of my country and the region and globally from the other side, and mostly the legacy for the young generation of leaders that I was about to leave, because I was still one of the youngest leaders in my country and the world to be elected as the head of state in that year. And so it was the combination of all of this which kind of like made my job much harder and much difficulties, because for me it was not only the constitutional obligation, which was under brackets an easy part for me to do that, but was much harder to be able to deal with this level of the mentality that I was about to face, not only within the political class in our country, which was very much male dominated, but also my country and the region of the Western Balkans is very male dominated society and very patriarchal society, which sometimes they think that the men's are there to lead and the women's to follow, which I was very much against this concept. And my point was also throughout my mandate also to change the perception of the people towards the women into the leadership position. And in many of the events, when I talk to the students, when I talk to the young generation, I use the example of a good friend of mine, the former president of Finland, Tarja Holland, and she used it very often. And one day I kind of like asked her permission to be able to quote in her story that in her second mandate as the president of the Finland, she went and visited the kindergarten at her capital city, and she faced with the children of between 4 and 6 years of age, and she decided to ask all of the little girls and boys what they want to become when they grow up. And to her surprise, all of the girls were answering they want to become a president. And the man's different profession. So she said, I'm kind of like find very strange. So she decided to approach one young boy, said like, don't you want to become a president when you grow up? Said like, he looked at her and he said, men are not allowed in our country to become a president. And so for me was really a kind of like a mission in order to install the mentality that women are up to this job and they can do most of the time a far better job than the man has done so far. And so I'm proud to look back, despite the challenges that I have gone through, not only during my term as the president, but even now, almost 2 years after I left the office, in headlines were most of the time dominating. What is she wearing today? What kind of the bag she's having today? What kind of the hairstyle, makeup? And so these kind of the headlines have been dominating, which are very much of the chauvinist and the sexist approach on that. But for me, it was important to go beyond of these headlines and criticism in order to leave the legacy for the other young generation and women to be able to follow that.
What do you think we can do to combat that negative attitude that stems from the media portrayal of female leaders?
Well, Lali, that is a continuous challenge, not only in my small country of Kosovo, which has not more than 1.8 million of the population in the region of the Western Balkan. We have seen just what took place about almost 1 year ago with the presidential elections in the United States of America, and what actually took a part of the whole of the campaign, where most of the criticism are not about what you are unfolding, what kind of the decision you take, what kind of the policies you establish. And my approach has been is that to rise yourself above this one and never make a compromise with your principles and the values that you stand for them, and to be able to support each other. I don't want to be misunderstood here by the women, but sometimes I use the term that the women sometimes have a tendency to become a biggest enemy of their own kind. And in my own case, it were the women in my country that started the first criticism, which today they are of the totally different opinion, and they are very much regretted why they have said and why they have made this kind of statements. But we women, no matter where we are, in our own countries, in our region or globally, we have to stick together, and we need to support each other, and we need to empower ourselves. And going one step further into that, I'm also the strong believer that the empowerment also starts from the family. How the women are, how the mother are educating the young daughters, and mainly about the role of the fathers within our society, and how they also see the empowerment of their daughters within the family. So it is a kind of like an ongoing cycle that we need continuously to invest on that and to improve that.
Okay, so on the issue of the lack of female representation in leadership and politics, I think it would be fair to say that it's a problem that's not limited by region or by culture. Why do you think that the problem still persists, even though it's been highlighted to be something that holds societies back?
Well, it's a combination of all of this that I have mentioned, that started from the family level of the education, of their further education, of their empowerment within the society. And something that we as a country, that I can say proudly, that we are a leading country in the southeastern part of the Europe or the Western Balkan. When we speak about the the empowerment of the role of the women across the board has been by offering the equal opportunities to the women and men's. By introducing the quota into our system, starting from the constitution of our country, legislation of our country as well. And we can have a much longer debate when we speak about the quota. I have my personal opinion about the quota, but I am a strong believer that the quantity leads you towards the quality, especially when you have the case, like it was the case of my country, and you have many of other examples around the world on the transitional and post-transitional societies, where you need to have a much more of the rigid policies to be introduced in order to have the sustainability of some of the processes. In this case, the role of the women within the society of our country. And so that's why we introduced the quota, which foresees about 30% of the women into the politics. In the Parliament of Kosovo, for example, has at the moment about 32% of the women into the parliament across all political parties in the parliament. Not saying that the women parliamentarians are, few of the women in the parliament are being more voted than the men's into the voting process. And we have also the same quota to be introduced into the public service. Back in 2012, I kind of like enforced more into this regard. After I have hosted the Global Summit of Women in Kosovo, I have introduced so-called the Pristina Principles, which is a set of the guidelines which foresees the improvement of the role of the women within Kosovo society by increasing from 30% up to the 50% of the public servants women by 2050, by granting the equal property rights and other matters, which was something new introduced back in 2012, but now has become a normal norm of the action and behavior within our institutional and the social life of the Kosovar people.
Okay, thank you. I think now's really the perfect time to open up some questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you raise your hand, and we'll try and get a microphone over to you. See one over there.
I thank you for your excellent talk, which I've enjoyed greatly. I'd like to ask you how your role as a person who grew through the ranks in the police force has shaped your decisions during your presidency, because I believe that you reached the position of, here would be High Commissioner in the police force. Am I correct in this?
Yes. I did not only make the history by being the first woman president, but I was also the first woman General Lieutenant Colonel within the Kosovo Police, an organization which marked about over 10,000 men and women within that organization, which definitely has shaped also me as an individual to be able to face the challenges that I was about to take and I have taken over as the head of state back in 2011. And one line that has continued following me, even as in my previous capacity as the public servant, starting as a young lawyer immediately after the end of the war, until I finished my mandate as the president, has been serving to the people and serving to the country. And something that kind of like I kept as the goal that we are there to serve the people in needs in my previous capacities. And becoming a president, I was elected by the people of the country to serve them, because they are our employees as the politicians, no matter where we are. And we should be accountable only to them when they trust their vote upon us, and we have to rise ourselves beyond that and to be able only to serve in our best knowledge and abilities.
See your hand's gone up just over there.
Thank you for your speech. I have a slightly different question. What is your opinion on Albanian minority in Macedonia and war of 2001? How do you see they should go about in their country?
Yeah. Kosovo has an excellent relation with all of the neighboring countries, including the neighboring country of Macedonia. All of the countries in the southeastern part of Europe are unique when you speak about their internal composition, where for Kosovo I considered and I continue to consider one of the biggest strengths of our country and our institution has been the way of living together, where all of the citizens, regardless of their ethnic background or regardless of their minority backgrounds, enjoys by the Constitution equal rights and equal obligation. Future of Kosovo, future of all of the regional countries, including Macedonia, is towards the EU and towards the European integration. And our progress, including the rights of the community groups, no matter belong to the majority or towards the minority, will be measured strictly as we move in the process of the European integration. Macedonia is also very much aware of the Ohrid agreement that has been signed, and as much as they can apply to this agreement, that will favor to all of the community groups there, but also towards their Euro-Atlantic integration.
I see your hand's popped up just over there.
Thank you for your speech. I would like to ask something about the relations between Kosovo and Serbia. What do you see as the main challenge for the reconciliation between Kosovo and Serbia and the region in general? And also, you mentioned earlier that there were around 20,000 women that were raped in the Kosovar war. Is there any apology that was issued to these women or to the war victims in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, when we speak about the relation between Kosovo and neighboring country of Serbia, 19 years ago, Kosovo has came out of the terrible war, which left behind not only the country which has been totally destroyed from the infrastructure, but also from the human life. Over 13,000 people killed and massacred. Still, now 19 years after the end of the war, we have about 1,600 people missing in different massive graves within the territory of Kosovo and territory of Serbia. And the continuous refusal stand by Serbia not to share with the Kosovo the data and the statistics of the where the remains of the bodies of the loved ones are, and over 20,000 women and men which have been raped during the wartime as a tool of a war. Back in 2012, Kosovo has started the process of the dialogue with the neighboring country of Serbia under the facilitation of the European Union. So far, over hundreds of agreements has been reached, starting from the technical dialogue and all the way now to the process of the political dialogue. Unfortunately, the process of the implementation of these agreements are not going in the direction or in the speed that we expected to be, though the main precondition for Kosovo, mainly for Serbia, on their accession process towards the European Union will be the normalization of the relation with Kosovo, including the recognition of the independence of Kosovo coming from Serbia. In purpose, I mentioned earlier that when I mentioned the survivors of the sexual violence, that not even a single perpetrator had been put forward to the the justice for these 19 years after the end of the war. This culture of the impunity, which is a global phenomenon, but mostly it is very dominant in Kosovo, because we should not forget that we have the neighboring country of Bosnia that has over 44,000 women that had been raped during the wartime from the Milosevic regime of Serbia, and no apologies of whatsoever has taken part, neither towards Bosnia, neither towards Kosovo. And when we speak about the future normalization, that is a very crucial and very fundamental as a starting point that will contribute to the further reconciliation in the region.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one final question, so if you go to the hand just in the aisle over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, you said when you founded that platform and a lot of women didn't or were shy to come forward because of that huge stigma of being a rape victim. Do you think Kosovo has been able as a country to overcome that stigma?
It's true, actually, because the survivors of the sexual violence, they have not only suffered during the wartime, but to our shame as the community, as the society, which is very male-dominated, again, I repeat, we have stigmatized them continuously for 15 years after the end of the war by pointing the fingers towards them unjustly, instead of pointing the fingers towards the perpetrators of these horrendous crimes, but by covering them with a veil of shame, that it's your shame what has happened to you, that has contributed to further stigmatize them and to further keep as a taboo topic within the society. When I took over the office back in 2011, it was exactly the same week when I was elected, when I had the first meeting with the survivors of the sexual violence. I want to tell you very bluntly and very open that 1 week after I had that meeting, I was not emotionally, even physically ready to have a state agenda for 1 week after that meeting. First of all, being a woman of that country and witnessing something that I could never ever think that could happen to my country and to the women of my country. That day, it was just literally little over a week I took over the office. I met 36 women in one of the villages in the central part of the country. I met a mother that she was raped when she was 35 years old, together with her 3 daughters. The oldest one 17, the middle one 15, and the youngest one 13 with a Down syndrome. Her mother was at her home that day visiting her. Without being able to cope with what has happened that day, she went outside, jumped in the well of water, committing a suicide. I met a mother that she was kept for 6 months by paramilitary forces of Serbia and systematically raped for continuous 6 months. The day that the forces were ordered to leave that village, they raped her 5-year-old daughter. I met women which their breasts were cut. They had still open scars of the cuts with 4 S's, which is a Serbian sign, throughout their body. And their stories have been kept in a silence unjustly for the continuous 15 years. It took me 2 years to be able to find the proper constitutional space or the base to empower me as the president, because Kosovo is parliamentary democracy. Executive powers falls under the government, foreign policy and national security under the president, while legislative falls under the parliament. In order to find the base which would empower me to deal actively with the status of the survivors of the sexual violence, where I created the National Council for the Survivors of the Sexual Violence. Not only dealing with their legal status, their rehabilitation, resocialization, and reintegration, including the access to the medical services, but at the same time dealing with the stigma which was dominating within our societies. We have moved quite far for these past 5 years, but we are still very far where we really have to be. As a society, supporting the survivors, but mostly on the basic thing what the survivors need, and the most important, seeing all of those who has committed these crimes facing the justice and tackling the culture of the impunity. At the end of the day, every victim that I spoken, being in Kosovo or being in the region or elsewhere, the only thing what they need is, we just want to see whoever has done this to me facing the justice. And we have failed as a country, and we are failing, unfortunately, globally. If I would say to you today that the status of the survivors of the sexual violence in Kosovo is still not internationally recognized. And do you know the reason why? Because Kosovo is not a member state of the United Nations. How in accordance to the human rights is when the leading global organization like the UN does not recognize this crime?
Thank you. I think that's unfortunately all we've got time for today, but if you could all please join me in saying a huge, huge thank you to the President for joining us here today.